Well, thank you all for coming. I often like to get a sense of who's in the room. So with the show of hands, how many of you are already familiar with the Lean Startup methodology? So good, about half of you, that's good. So I'm not going to cover any basic Lean Startup stuff, but I'm going to definitely build on a lot of the ideas that are already out there. So I also like this to be very interactive. You know, we talked about book giveaways. So if you do have questions, feel free to stop me and ask your question right away. Don't wait till the end. So we try to make it as interactive. By way of introduction, I do like to say that I've been an entrepreneur for many, many years. I have been a technical founder. I still am with the company that I am running now. And so I try to write code almost every day. It's getting harder as my roles are getting kind of morphed over time. But I still consider myself very much of a technical entrepreneur, and I'm going to share some of the ideas that are in the book more from that techie perspective. So let's start out with a sad, harsh reality. So this is the odds that we all live with, is that most products fail, most startups fail. And many of you know that these odds are pretty low. Whether it's 90% or higher or lower, it's kind of irrelevant. It's just a very high number. But the number one reason that products fail, and to me, this is what got me excited about trying to find a repeatable process to vet product ideas, was that the number one reason products fail was not because we failed to build the product we set out to build, but because we spend time, money, and effort building the wrong product. And so how do we really correct that? So let's take a step back and first talk about why does this even happen. The first thing I like to attribute is this myth of the visionary entrepreneur. So we have this myth that all we need to do is build a great product and kind of the rainbows come out and magic happens. And there are some very rare instances where people do stumble into those kinds of products, where there's an opportunity and they just happen to stumble into it, but then they have to ride the wave, and there's a lot that also has to happen afterwards to make it all work. But that aside, I find that this is a very deliberate process. So oftentimes when we look at our product, all we see is the solution box, because that's what we're in love with. We want to build great products, we love the technology, we love the solution, what I like to call awesome here. Now, we should be so lucky that what we consider to be awesome is awesome for a lot of people, and that's really what we're trying to get to. So down below, I've got a quote by Mark Zuckerberg. This is something he said not when he started building Facebook, but this was years later after he had moved to Silicon Valley, raised a whole round of money. Even back then, he thought that he was just doing something that was a fun side project. He would quit his job at Facebook in a few years and actually grow up and build a real company. So even back then, he was just hacking away and thought all he had to do was build great products and solutions. As I said, in his case, he was one of those, and call them lucky few, that stumbled into something, of course, architected and designed a system that allowed him to scale very rapidly, and a lot to his credit of how he executed afterwards. But for a lot of us, it's a lot more deliberate attempt. So that's the first thing I like to put out there, is redefining what the real solution is. It's not just the technology or the solution we're building, but there's more to it. The second thing, and this is also counterintuitive, is that product development actually gets in the way. And this is counterintuitive because we are ultimately building products for customers. But the reason that's counterintuitive, or why it gets in the way, is that if we look at that original statement of why products fail, it's because we go away for a very long period of time building what we think we should build based on some learning in the early stages of that development cycle, where we go and talk to customers, might get some requirements. We go build this product over several weeks, months, sometimes years, only to find out when we launch that nobody really wanted this. So in that big middle, that's when we go away and we spend a lot of time either building the wrong features or building too many features. And when we launch, to no surprise, the customers and markets don't exist because we've just gone completely off the rails. And so that's what are going to try to avoid. We're going to try to see how we can both make these cycles smaller, as well as incorporate experimentation and customer learning along the way. This last thing, and being a technical founder, I can tell you, is that people pay lip service to this stuff. And when I first started hearing about talking to customers, I went and did it. And boy, did they send me on wild goose chases. So it's not just going and talking to customers, but knowing what to ask them and how to ask them. So I would go into these interviews, and out of pity, probably, a lot of them would tell me, just go and do these things, and I will buy. And I would go and do those things, and nobody would buy. And after repeated attempts, I just came to this conclusion that talking to customers was useless. And this is the Henry Ford quote a lot of people like to put in front, especially the techies, saying, if Henry Ford had talked to people, they would have also sent him on a wild goose chase, tell him to go and build faster horses and not mass-produce the automobile. But in recent years, I've come back to look at this code, and I actually find a hidden gem in here, and that is that there's a hidden problem description. The customers are really telling you that they are unhappy with their existing solution, which happens to be a horse, which is slow. So they're telling you the attributes that you need to correct for. If you can go and solve something that is faster than a horse and gives them the same level of convenience transportation, then you've got a product that's compelling. And that was best summed by Steve Jobs, which is, it's not the customer's job to know what they want. That's all of our jobs as entrepreneurs, to go and figure that out. So the best thing we can do when we talk to customers is to try to understand their worldviews, to try to understand their pains, their problems, their existing solutions, their workflow. And once we understand that half the problem is solved, we can then go out there and begin to craft. It feels like cheating, but once you understand your customers well enough, the solution becomes almost obvious. And as I said, for a lot of products, we don't have as much technical risk as we used to even several years ago. If you go back a decade, building software was very hard. We needed lots of licenses, expensive servers. With internet, cloud computing, open source technologies, we can do a lot of those things a lot faster now. So it's a great time to be a tech entrepreneur. Any questions so far? So let's dive into how do we actually take some of these kind of big problems that I put out there and put them to practice. So the first thing is there's this book that I wrote. It's meant to be a very tactical, actionable how-to guide, and I'm going to distill some of those ideas here. I want to summarize the core meta principles that I summarize in the book, or codify in the book. And for me, they're all built around this epiphany that the solution is not the product. It's really building a successful business or a business model. And once I looked at the business model as a product and not something you back into, so in my previous life, I would say just build a great product and the business model will take care of itself, or I write this business plan when I need to raise funding. Now I take a very deliberate approach, which is I start with the business model, and that is a product. And so these meta principles are all taken out of the product development playbook. So being a technical founder, I knew how to build products very well, and that's what I did here. So the first meta principle there is one of documenting your plan A. So before you start building something complex, you need to sketch it out. You need to have a model, and that's what this business modeling is about. It's really applying the divide and conquer technique. There's a lean canvas, some of you might be familiar with it, but it takes a traditional business plan, which is usually 60 pages long. It breaks it down into 9 building blocks that anyone can understand, and you put it on a single page, and it makes it very easy to then manipulate. So that's the first principle. The second one is one of identifying what's riskiest, not what's easiest. So if you were building a very hard, if you're trying to solve a very hard technical problem and you had 6 months to do it, you wouldn't start with what's easy, you would start with what's risky, so that when month 5 comes around, you're not scrambling with technical feasibility type issues. We fail to do that with our businesses. So similarly with our businesses, if we realize that what we are trying to build is really just a function of time, money, effort, then maybe we should expend more effort up front trying to de-risk the customers and the markets first. Maybe we see if anyone will buy something before we build. So that's what the second principle is about. And the third one is really about this concept of experimentation. So if you're familiar with Lean Startup, it's really doing the build, measure, learn loop, and one cycle around that is an experiment. You'll see a picture of that here for those of you that are new. So let's get down to like 10 points that I'd like to share about how to go about putting this stuff to practice. So the first one is not to be a feature pusher. So if you go back to where Lean Startup comes from, Lean really comes from Lean thinking, which goes back all the way to the Toyota production system. And one of the big principles there is one of customer pull. So ideally, you want to be able to put something out there and have customers pull it out of you. So Abby was telling how I was reluctant to write a book. I didn't write this book. I tell people, my readers pulled it out of me. So it was, again, one of those things where there was demand first, and then you explore that demand and decide whether it's a problem worth solving. So this is what the classic product roadmap would look like. We start with our release 1.0, and we go ahead and plan out all the other releases, down to, down several years, because this is our big vision. This is what we want to go realize over time. And this is backwards, because this is based on the assumption that we know what customers want. All we need to do is execute a plan. So this, in many ways, is the classic waterfall model that we're trying to change. The alternative approach is to really start with a minimum viable product, which is even sometimes a subset of release 1.0. And the way you get to that is not by coming up with a feature list and just stripping it down, but really understanding those customers and problems. And there are techniques to do that. There's interview techniques, observation techniques, to go and figure out what is that subset of the feature set that is compelling enough. It's still a minimum viable product. And I'll give you my definition of a minimum viable product, because there are a lot of others that are floating out there. My definition of a minimum viable product is that it has to be the smallest solution you build that still delivers customer value, and as a bonus can capture some of that value, which is just a fancy way of saying, if you're going to charge your customers, charge them from day one. So if you're solving a must-have problem for a customer and you deliver something even small, as long as it delivers some value, you should be able to collect some compensation for it. So that's really what my definition of that MVP needs to be. Now, once you start out with that MVP, there's this concept of customer pull. So even the MVP is tested with customers, but once you put that out there, there's a whole process of going from the MVP into the other features, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And I would say that I find a lot of people that practice lean startup, they're very rigorous about getting to that minimum viable product. So they go interview customers, they go and figure out what that minimal product is. When they launch, things don't go as planned. So they don't get this instant hockey stick curve. And so then they pull out all the feature bag tricks. They start throwing features at the problem instead of going back to the process. So I find that it's very important, even after you build the MVP, to go back and follow the process rigorously. So what I have here is MVF and MVR, kind of just my own acronyms for minimum viable feature. So if you were doing continuous deployment, you might push features individually, or your minimum viable release. And really what those are they're just packagings of things you would push out to customers. And I'm not putting small features, so things like defects or enhancements, small enhancements, those are not counted here. But anything big that you would want to blog about or you would want to announce to the public that I built something, come check it out, would really fall under that process umbrella. So if you're building something big, go through that process. I typically tend, so the question was how do you figure out who your most valuable customers are that you want to service? Because you might be addressing a lot of customer segments. And that's a very good question. So the first part of the process is really figuring that out. So getting to what I call problem solution fit. So you want to identify customers, you want to cast a wide net, maybe talk to a lot of different customers. When you show them the solution, some are going to have different reactions. Some of them are going to be, this is very interesting. Others are going to be, I want this now. And the ones that I want it now, if you price test, some of them will be like, well, this is interesting, but I would not pay anything more than $100. Others might be willing to pay $500 or $600. So it is through that process where you start to hone in on who your early adopters are. And that is the first challenge, is you want to find out who the early adopters are, who ideally want your MVP, your product or service, because they have a need today for it. It's not a need in the future. So it is through that pre-MVP process, you're trying to do three things. You're trying to identify customers, trying to identify a subset of them, so the early adopters. You're trying to understand what problems you are that are addressing, and then from there, the MVP is defined and scoped out. It's a good question. So the question was, do you go deep in features or do you go wide?
Deep on one feature as a demonstration of quality.
Yeah.
And his answer was depends on what type of company you are.
Yeah. So the question is, do you go deep on one feature or do you do breadth and cover a lot of the story? So I do think that yes, it depends. And when we come down to the, I think I'll have a slide here of showing the demo. So when you talk about the MVP, and there's a part of it where you put up an offer, so you show you basically demonstrate your MVP with some kind of a demo showcasing the features that are in there. And I always use a story narrative. So it's not just here's all the features we built in a bulleted list, or a bunch of random screenshots, but it's rather a story that says, I understand who you are as a customer, I know what pains you have, and so this is how we're going to solve it. And so if that requires going very deep around one particular use case, that's what the MVP should address. So I would really think, instead of depth or breadth, I would look at it more in terms of a must-have problem, their existing workflow, and what is the complete use case that delivers value to them. So if they have an existing workflow that has 10 steps, and if you can inject your solution and eliminate 5 of them, that may be a good place to start, and you might have to build 3 or 4 features to get that done. So it's trying to figure out what is the smallest thing you can build that customers will bear, but that will also address a pain point for them instead of thinking just in features and benefits, or just in terms of just feature lists. Yeah, so the question was, is price testing always money? So when I say, charge from day one, so I said if you intend to charge your users or customers, don't hide behind an alpha or beta label. You have to talk about pricing up front. The reason that's important is because price defines both your product, and I like to use bottled water. If you've got bottled water, if I say it's $1 versus $3, people in the room will pick one versus the other because if they have a sort of perception of maybe the $3 bottle being better. So price can define the customer, can define the product, or it can also define your customer segments. It will dictate who you attract. So if you go to an enterprise company and try to sell them a $20 product, they'll just say, no thanks, that's not for us. But if you put a couple zeros next to it, now you're in their ballpark. So pricing is very much part of the product, so that's why you want to test. But in cases where you have a multi-sided market, in those cases, like you have an ad-based business or a marketplace model, in those cases it's okay not to charge, because you would never want to charge, say, someone who's on a community side, because you're trying to build up attention. But there is still this concept of an asset, what I call a derivative currency. So you're still trying to build up enough users as an asset, and at today you start out being worth $0, but once you hit maybe 1,000 eyeballs, you're now worth $100. So you can come up with that derivative currency still to come up with that currency of exchange. And in that case, you're really asking for permission, saying, if I build this product for you, will you engage with it? Will you participate? And those would become the metrics you would use. Right, so the question is, how do you fall into the trap of doing a custom solution for just one customer? Yeah, and so that is definitely a trap, which is sometimes hard to navigate, because it's hard to sometimes say no to money. When a big company comes and says, build this for us, and they start leading you down the part of customization, you really have to ask yourself, and that's really, at the end of the day, it's a business model question. You have to ask yourself, are you in the professional services business or even the licensing business, or do you want to build something that's more scalable? And if the answer is that you want to build something that's more scalable, you don't want just one or two customers, you have to learn to always question what it is you're building and whether that can roll up into a platform or into a common reusable code base, for instance, that can be used across products. And there's not a very easy answer to that. Sometimes people would just do that as, say, a bootstrapping tactic, and then as long as it retained rights, they might refactor something out of it and then salvage some part that's reusable and try to productize that. So the learning is very valuable. You might still build some custom stuff, but there's things in there that are generally applicable. In other cases, you just have to be disciplined to say no, which is, and the best way to do that is to not just have one big paying customer, but try to get other customers, big or small, and then weigh their needs against kind of the general kind of good or what's common across the product. So maybe not a very straight answer, but it really kind of is something you have to navigate and figure out what business model you're really in. Because if there's sometimes enough zeros attached with even a custom project, like I said, it may be a good bootstrapping tactic as a learning tool, and then you get back into something more scalable afterwards. Yeah, so when you're pre-venture, pre-angel, no money, how do you find customers? The same way that you find them when you do have money. In some ways, it's just picking up the phone or it's going and talking to them. So at this stage, and so I think your question more is, how do you find them at scale? So sometimes you need money, like to go into advertising or invest in channels. And that's the nice thing about this process is that, yeah.
I don't even mean how to find customers to use your product. How do you find them? How do you find people to interview and get out of them?
Right. Yeah, and that's where I was kind of going, is that in the earliest stages, you don't need lots and lots of users. You just need a few good customers. There's probably going to be a slide that will say exactly that. And so the way that you do that is through even outbound techniques. So you might use your referral networks. You might even resort to cold calling, and there are techniques for how you can make that work to your benefit. But at the beginning, it's not about finding hundreds or thousands of people to use your product. It's even finding 10. Like a good test that I put out to people who are building SaaS-based products is go and demonstrate early traction. Go and find 10 people who will say they'll buy your product. They don't even have to buy it. If you can go and demonstrate your product and they commit to buying it, that's a step in the right direction. Many of us don't even go through that rigor of trying to get to that stage. So we're not talking about thousands, even just 10 people, which, like I said, you don't need money to do that. A lot of people can go do it. The obvious question is going to be, how is that statistically significant? So if I talk to just 10 people, I'm trying to build a product for thousands of people, how does that really extrapolate up? And my answer to that is that when all 10 people say they don't want your product, that's pretty significant. And that's really the norm. Because when you're building something new and bold, you go out there, and despite your best attempts, people will not get it. So when you can get 10 people to say yes, it doesn't guarantee that you'll scale, but it gives you permission to go on to the next stage, which is maybe I'll build something now and test it with these 10 and then work on those channels to scale beyond that. And those 10 people will give you a lot of learning, and that's what the whole methodology is about. So let's move on, because I know we've got a finite time, and I know these are great questions, but keep asking them, and we'll kind of morph these along the way if we need to. So the key message with what I showed early on is that it's when you're building things in the lean way, it's important to have a big vision, but it's equally important to go small on that roadmap. So how you realize that vision is still a question mark. So it may be, as you plan, you're going to build those 5 releases over a year period, but it could be that as you start learning, a lot of the features get reprioritized. What you end up building is not where you ended up, which is more the norm. Most products that succeed by drastically changing their original visions and plans along the way. So number 2, every one of these releases, which I'll call an experiment, needs to end in customer learning. So this is what I would call the experiment loop. This is the build, measure, learn loop. And there are 3 very important attributes here. We want to go as quickly as possible around this loop. So when we have ideas, we want to build product. And the product may not even be a finished product. It may be a mock-up. It may be a screenshot. But we want to build it as quickly as possible. We want to put it in front of customers and start measuring their reactions. So even a demo with a customer is a kind of an experiment. Because you're putting a manifestation of what you're going to build in front of them, and they're having a reaction to it, positive or negative. And we want to measure data, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, and at the end of the process, we need to end up in customer learning. So speed is very important. Learning is very important at the end, and this learning isn't about how we build great product, but rather what was the customer behavior change, or what was the customer reaction to what we put in front of them. So it's all customer-driven learning. And something I talk a lot about is focus. How do you really focus on the right experiments to run so that you're not running into premature optimization traps? So you're not trying to scale to millions of users when you have 0 users today. When you launch, you probably will have maybe 10, but nowhere near 1 million. So why start with that obsession over code optimization or server optimization? There's a lot of those kinds of things that you have to balance, and it's all about identifying what's riskiest for the whole product, not just for the technology, but for the whole product, and prioritizing your work around that. So what I'm going to show now is a conceptual model. This was actually a Kanban board that I used for a while, and then at the end, if we have time, I'll show you a more evolved version of this. But this is how I started out. So there's a lot of you should be familiar with Kanban, a lot of you are familiar with Agile. So in both of those processes or methodologies, there's the backlog, in progress, and the done state. What Agile does really well, and a lot of people say Lean in some ways is Agile plus or Lean startups for kind of business or more business focused. And I would say that what Lean ends up doing is it redefines what done really means. In the Agile world, we don't have a very clear definition. So when the guys who wrote the Agile manifesto, their definition of done was we are code complete. We're actually, I would say we have built features as per spec. So we have fulfilled the contract that we as developers signed up for, what we signed up for. And unfortunately, that's sometimes not enough. So going back to my early statement, it's not about not building products. We can build products per spec, unit tested, refactored, very polished, all commented. But if customers don't want it, then all of that stuff doesn't really matter. So what Lean Startup does, it adds a 4th column to this table, which is the validated learning column. So we have to be able to end every feature not when we are done coding or when we are done deploying, but rather when we are done learning from customers. If customers can validate that this feature is really something they want, that's the true definition of us being done with it. And otherwise, the right thing to do is to kill that feature off. So I'm going to build this up. I've added some more columns here, and we'll just incrementally walk through this for the rest of the talk. So this is how we typically build features. So at the very top here is the stuff we're working on. Down below are things that are ready or done. So this is kind of a split board. Sometimes we do this all in one column, but I'm just doing this here for illustration. And then the green sections are really, I talked about building that continuous feedback loop. The green sections are all the places where, while we're building this feature, we're going to be interacting with customers. So we're not going away in isolation, building things and then testing what they feel, but we're going to do this validation along the way. The next thing is that as entrepreneurs, we get hit by hundreds of things to do. So this is the premature optimization trap type of stuff. We can be optimizing code, we can be optimizing landing pages, what should really we be working on? So this is where, again, you have to figure that the product you're building is like a funnel. The customer lifecycle is really a funnel, and you have to start in order. So if you don't have a way to acquire enough customers to start learning, trying to build a great product is a form of waste because you don't have anyone to really learn from. So you have to invest enough time there. Once you have a product, maybe the onboarding is all bad. People sign up, but half of them kind of just drop out. So rather than trying to go and optimize your payment system or go and optimize your referral system, you might still, again, want to fix that part first. So there's really a process of how you go around this. So it's really about identifying, at this point in time, what is that single key metric that is holding you back, that in some ways has that 10x potential. If you were to solve this, all of a sudden you get 10 times as many customers, and I'm talking even small scale. In the beginning, you might be having 100 visitors, but maybe 10 people that successfully make it. Well, why don't we make it a goal to get all 100 of them through at least that first step? So there are these big returns that can be made by identifying just a few single key metrics. And one of the things when you first start out is that the metrics you really focus on are more around value. The big question you're asking yourself once you build the MVP is, if I build something that enough people even find valuable before you worry about scaling? Yeah, so if we look at this customer lifecycle, I'll kind of highlight what that is from a metrics perspective. So I would say delivering value is solving a customer's need or problem. So if you look at some of you should be familiar with this picture. This is the Dave McClure startup metrics or pirate metrics. Then he calls it pirate metrics because if you use the first letter of all these words, it spells the word R, which is something pirates like to say. So him being a marketer, he came up with that, not me. But really what this is, it's really I'll quickly walk through what each of these steps are. So the acquisition step is, let's just take a web-based product. Acquisition is converting people who are unaware about your product to someone who are now interested. So this might be done on your marketing website. They learn about your product, they click the sign up button because now they want to use it. Activation is them having that first experience with your product, and it has to be a good first experience. So if you have a bad first experience, they click the sign up button but nothing happens, well, guess what? They're not picking up the phone and asking you why isn't this working, and they're just leaving. So you have to have a first good experience, and that's what activation is. Typically it's the first feature interaction. So if you were Twitter, for example, you might define activation as getting through the sign-up process and sending out your first tweet. So to be able to do that, that would be an activated user because they get what Twitter is about. Retention is just, like it says, it measures the act of them coming back to your site. Revenue is them paying over in the short term or long term any transaction events, revenue events. And referral is them telling others about your product. So if you look at on this picture, what constitutes value metrics at first are going to be that first user experience. So what does that activation rate look like? So if I have 100 people entering this funnel, but only 20 of them are successfully tweeting something in the Twitter example, then I have an activation problem because I'm losing 80 people out of the 100 people every single day. And so that would be a bad, I would not be delivering value to customers because they never really get to use my product. Once you can solve the activation problem, the next value metric is really around retention, which is, there are a lot of products that are these one-hit wonders, or I would call them one sign-up wonders. People come and sign up because they were interested, but after they try out the product, they may even activate, but they don't find anything compelling to make them come back, and they just leave and never come back. So usually the one-day sign-ups, and we use this a lot in video games, but it applies to any kind of product, is the one-day sign-up drop-offs are usually very high. So you'll get a number of people come in, sign up, use your product, but then never ever return because you didn't deliver something valuable or compelling to them. So measuring what your retention is another key macro metric to measure. And then I put sometimes revenue in that same value metric, but I make it dotted because in some, like as someone asked the question before, sometimes revenue doesn't really apply in a multi-sided market. But more importantly, if you're delivering value and you are charging from day one, the revenue should match retention. So they pretty much mirror each other. If you're delivering value and you're charging, people are staying around, they're going to be paying you. So revenue you can track, but it's not as critical if you track these two things in the beginning. Now, once you get your value metrics down, so these are like how you would prioritize your key metrics when you first launch. Once you can get enough people to use your product, you go to the third stage, which is all about scalability. Then you start asking the engine of growth question, which is how do we grow something that's already working? So we're delivering value, how do we grow this business model? And there are 3 ways you can do it. And so this is something that Eric Ries talks about in his book. I mentioned it briefly at the end of mine, but it's this concept of the engine of growth. So if you look at this customer lifecycle, you can grow by adding more people at the top of the funnel. So that would be hitting the acquisition trigger, and that's the paid engine of growth. So you might use paid advertising, you might hire a sales force to go acquire more customers. You might even use social media, and even though that seems like it's not free because it requires human resources to operate. So you still have to pay for time and for the upkeep of that channel. So that's why it's the paid engine of growth. You might be able to get people to stay with your product longer. So that's the sticky engine of growth. You might build in certain features that people can't live without, or you have their data, and so for them to migrate elsewhere is not an option because you kind of have that data lock-in. So that's where the sticky engine of growth comes in. And that's just increasing that retention macro on that lifecycle picture. And then the final engine of growth is the referral engine of growth. So once you've got enough people that go through the value funnel and they become happy paying customers, some of them want to share this goodness with other people. So you either give them tools to do so or you incentivize them to do so, and that would be the viral or referral engine of growth. So if you come back to this picture, I'm now going to walk through what typically goes through in my company, Spark 59. So when we have a product that's out there, in our backlog, we start collecting a list of features, and we have a triage method. So the first thing we really do is really ignore everything that comes in. So if customers start asking for things, we pay attention to it. Obviously, if it's a severity one, like the servers are going down, we need to jump and fix them right away. I wouldn't count that here in the backlog. But these are things more like feature requests. We'd like you to build this, or ourselves coming up with feature requests. Wouldn't it be nice if we build these features out? So we usually just collect those. And the first question we ask ourselves is that, do these features currently align with our current key metric? So if these features are about trying to improve referral and we have an activation problem, we might put that on the back burner. Not that it's not important, it's just not as important right now. So that's how we do some feature triage. But once we do pick a feature to go work on, the first step is to really try to understand the problem. And this process that I'm showing you here is the same thing that we do with a new minimum viable product we're building, or a feature that's a big feature that we're building once the product is launched. So we try to understand the problem, and the way we do this is we really set up calls with existing customers or with new customers, and we try to understand why this feature is important. So not just in terms of benefits, but what business case can we make for this feature? What problem does it help the customer to solve? I already mentioned this before, that if we can really identify the problems, sometimes even the features become very clear in terms of what we need to build. So you might sometimes get a feature request such as, we need another screen to go and do this report, and you realize that if you really find out why people need that report, maybe there's another way they can get to that data. So that we call that a severity 2. It's a customer request, but there's a workaround. They can still get the data, and once you give them that workaround, they may not need the feature anymore. So you really need to understand the root problem that they're asking for and not just jump through hoops to try to please every customer that has a feature request. And you always want to prioritize for that problem we're solving. So again, customers will have lots of needs and wants. You have to go through that triage process to see, does it align with our current priorities from a key metrics perspective? But also, if we were to build this, is it a one-off? Like, is it only one customer asking for it? Or are there more that would have the same need? So the technique of ignoring customer requests for a while is something that can be effective, like in a BBC environment. So when you start getting a feature that's repeatedly asked, it all of a sudden bubbles itself up in priority, as opposed to rushing and trying to triage every one of them. So there's kind of a process of how you would do it. In my book, I have a flow chart of how we think through it, but it's very similar to what I described. Now, at the end of that problem we're solving, a feature can either get trashed. So we have had instances where once we understand the problem, there's a ready workaround, or this is not a compelling thing to go work because it might be one of those one-offs. So we either kill it or we move it to the next part on the board, which is the design stage, or I would call it the defined solution stage. And so here we go through a mock-up process. We go and sketch this up to a place where we can actually show it to customers and get their feedback on it. So before building code, we try to do this with a lot of those big features where there's a lot of either UX risk or there's a lot of not knowing what it is that we need to go build. We will go ahead and do the design work because that's stuff we have to do anyways. But rather than then continuing on to write code and wire it all up, we'll then go and show those mock-ups to our customers and say that problem we talked about, this is how we're going to go solve it. Does it really solve your problem? And if we get that, yes, this is awesome, we really want it, we can't wait, then we progress to the next step. Yeah, so that's a great question. So if there's, I know I've not been keeping track of books, but maybe I'll start doing that now. We can probably give a book on that one. So the fidelity of the mock-up, the fidelity of the demo is a great question. I would say it depends on the customer segment that you're addressing. So if you're trying to build something for developers, you might get away with just a verbal description sometimes or wireframing. If it needs to be something to a customer that may need to visually see something, you have to build something a lot higher fidelity. So it might be a video, it might be an actual screenshot. And so I'm going to show you how we actually build this for one of our products. Yeah, so maybe the question was, how do you really put this into play in more established companies where there's more kind of resistance to these ideas? Yeah, so I would say that in many ways, like I'll just come out and say that lean requires a lot of behavior change. And so we are talking about redefining job roles here. We're talking about developers caring about partial rollouts, which takes more work, partial and then full rollouts, instrumentation metrics, which sometimes takes more work on a feature-by-feature basis. And sometimes people don't want to hear those answers. It also requires you getting outside the building and doing this mock-up work, which may seem like more work, but I'll tell you that we have killed more features just through this early validation process than the alternative where we would just build something and then realize that nobody wanted. But to answer your question, I think it fundamentally comes down to, lean in general comes down to this catalyst moment when people are ready to adopt these methodologies. So lean is fundamentally about being less wasteful, and you can't really appreciate waste unless you've been wasteful before. So when we build products the traditional way and we realize that we have maybe this waterfall process, but we're dumping millions of dollars at the end of the day and not really getting the results we want, I found that people are more interested in running their own experiments with lean. Even the bigger companies are coming up with innovation teams and smaller teams to say, let's go and test these methodologies in small scale, and we'll adopt some of these processes and see how they really perform against the alternative. And I think that's the right approach. That's the way that you want to test the methodology. You don't take it on faith alone. Yeah, so I would say in the beginning it was just it was on this board. We would just kind of and things wouldn't really surface. Like it's too much to store the backlog, because that itself is a whole art, the whole backlog grooming. So we have just gotten to this point where, like I said, we ignore things at first, but if something registers enough because it matches our current metric and it's a problem that seems important enough, we will then put it on the backlog. So it's different people do it differently. I've seen kind of bigger companies like Defect just having this big database of backlog, but it creates more meetings to go and triage that. So we just do it on the fly and try to prioritize things. If we are wrong, a problem repeatedly surfaces over and over again, and we can't ignore it because we are we are very customer focused and customer facing, I should say. We make the channels very easy for them to request things. Yeah, so the channels for how customers request things. So I would say that when I talk about this stuff and I say you have to go and talk to customers, a lot of people ask me, when does that stop? And I have to burst their bubble and say the process never really stops. You have to build this continuous feedback loop with customers. And so there are lots of easy things that you can do. I mean, some of it is, I'll throw out a few things that we use. So some of them are just simple feedback buttons on your site, so things like Snap Engage or Wholearc, where people can just submit a request and say this is broken, or I would like this to be different, or I like a feature change. We have that live with chat, so while we are online and working, customers can actually have a chat conversation with us. So that has been sometimes very helpful, even in converting people who are browsing on a site they have questions, and we've converted them to actually buying the product because they have a question, we address it on the spot. They're like, wow, that's good service. We're going to buy this right on the spot. So it's a good technique that has some benefits there. Other things that I've done is I've personally, when I had a startup, and you can do this at scale, of course, I can't do it anymore, but when I had a startup and I was obscure, people didn't call that number. I actually had an 800 number on the site, and I wired it to my mobile phone. So when customer service requests would come in, I would be the one that would answer. And just announcing myself as the founder of the company just changed the level of conversation. So people couldn't believe they were talking to the person who wrote the product. They're used to talking to some customer service rep that doesn't really know the product that well or doesn't care about them. So I would turn that into a customer development process. So I would answer their question, which usually took 1 or 2 minutes, and then I would ask them 3 or 4 questions, which is how do they find the product, who are they, why are they using this? And so that would get me to understand my customers better. More recently, and I'll show this over here, hopefully we'll get through all these slides, but I'll
You're fine, because you're doing Q&A in it, so.
Okay, so very good. But the other technique that we use is lifecycle messaging. And so at different points in the customer lifecycle, we automatically trigger messages. So if you are familiar with Lean Canvas, if you sign up today, right now to Lean Canvas, you'll get an email from me, but it's not really from me. It's an automated message, but it comes from my email address. It looks like I wrote it. And there's a clear disclaimer that this is an automated message, but I read and reply to every one of those. So that's another way that I'm constantly in the loop of what customers are really, I make myself very available to answer questions that customers might have or interactions that they want to have with me. So those are some of the kinds of channels that we build. Right, so the question is, have I ever run into a situation where a developer didn't want to change?
Right, or
and
a UX person.
A UX person. I would say that, so I run these boot camps with entrepreneurs, and part of it is in some ways suspending your belief. All I really ask for when I do this is to say, you have run products this old way, let's try this new way, even for a small feature, even for an experiment, and see if the learning helps. So customer interviews is a great thing. I have a lot of developers, and I was one of those where I've talked to customers before, very ineffective. So what I did is I devised a script, because I knew that if I had a script and I had used fancy words like falsifiable hypotheses, I now had a goal with these interviews. It was not just a conversation, which I don't like, just doing and wasting my time. So now if I turn that into let me go and run one interview and see if I learned anything different, that's the only ask that I would make of that developer. And for me personally, I found that the learning was very, very addictive. One, it was not as scary as I thought. Once I started talking to customers, it actually came very easily and naturally because I had a script that kind of at least let me ask these questions. The next thing is that the secret of interviewing is really talking less and letting the other person talk more. So you don't really even have to talk that much, and that's why it's so easy. But what I learned is that I got so much learning in here. The features that I was trying to build were all wrong, and I just realized that had I gone the alternative route, it would have been a very long learning cycle. And this way I was able to learn at a much rapid pace. And that's why I make myself very available to immerse myself, and I make time to talk to customers almost every day. I answer emails almost every day. But I think to answer your question, it's really one of those things where there is a little leap of faith that one has to make, and sometimes you basically need the right trigger moment to help that be possible. And maybe it's doing a very small thing and having that be a positive additive experience than trying to have them change a lot of things. So even if it might be using metrics to say, let's analyze if this feature was any good, let's plug in something like Mixpanel or User Cycle or something like that, and let's go and see if we can correlate actual feature usage with revenue, for example. That's an exercise that most people will say, yeah, sure, that's a good data problem, let's go solve that. But even that kind of a side project can be very rewarding once you can tie the learning back to a key metric that really should matter for the product. So I think it's different in every case, that you have to figure out what that right hook is to get them to take the next small step to try the process. If I was to summarize, the question is, if you were to kill things at the latter stages, how do you really justify it? So I would say that if you follow the process rigorously, the odds of you killing something up until this stage get to be lower, because you're doing mockups, you're getting buy-in, you're rolling out in small scale, you're getting data that this is actually working. It's sometimes usually when you get to the quantify stage where you put this out there and all those people that said they would engage with your product or they would use it don't actually do it. The right answer is not a simple answer, is to kill that feature. So just like we should spend time adding features, when we leave features that are unused, that's just technical debt. That's just maintenance that we have to do. And like you said, it creates this legacy of a product. In my earlier life, when I was building one of these products, I was just listening to what customers said, especially those that weren't paying me, and said, and dangled the carrot, which is if I build these features, they would. And pretty soon I built this bloated monster with all these features in it. And I decided to stop that process. And I went to the quiet people, the people who were actually paying me weren't really complaining. And I got them on the phone, and they actually said, yeah, I don't know why you keep adding these new things. They're just distracting me. I only use 20% of your product or something like that. And so I decided to fire for that product, I fired all my free users. I got rid of the freemium plan. I went to the paid users and removed all the features, made the product simple again, and then build these channels with them where I could now listen to a few people, but they were paying, and so their feedback carried a lot more weight. But then using something like this along the way, it doesn't mean that you don't still build, the bad features don't get up to this stage, but you have to have the discipline to really kill it, and you're really using kind of data at that point to justify that. No, it doesn't have to get that complicated. So I've always had the luxury of, like, I've run many products as a solo founder, so I've been the one that has to do all those things. But when I work with other teams, or now I have a team of people, we try to make it be cross-functional. So you do want to have rotation. Ideally, you want to have different roles, and that's in some ways to avoid confirmation bias. So if you are the only person in an interview, or I would say a confirmation or even selection bias, you can basically pick the feedback that you want, and you can delude yourself in hearing what you want to hear. So it's always good, just from a general practice, to have more than one person, if possible, do those kinds of interviews. But it really needs to be a cross-functional role. So the developers need to have some empathy in knowing that when a customer says this is not going to work, they can probably on the fly come up with a solution and maybe even test that with the customer. Say, what if we did this? That's something a product manager may or may not be able to do on the fly because they don't know if this is technically feasible or not. At the same time, having someone who's a product manager is important because sometimes the way you craft the problem is just as important. Someone may not get it, but if you change a few words, you now get through. So I find that the easy answer is to say that everyone is involved in the process. In reality, that's hard to put to practice because many people are really doing what we call maker work. They're working inside the building to go outside as a distraction. And so I find that there are some compromises. Sometimes it's figuring out times in the schedule where you can do more kind of interview days where you can just piggyback. You don't even have to say a word being a developer. You just piggyback and watch the interviewing process and see what you can pick up from it. Other times, the people out in the field might be able to record these interviews. We do that with usability tests and let you see the results, because again, then it makes it a lot more real. Because when somebody just comes back and reports results to you, the first inclination is that you must have run the test wrong. You probably talked to the wrong customer and you didn't ask the questions right. You just don't know what you're doing. So you have to actually go out there and kind of witness it. So in the lean world, we call it the Gemba, which is you go to where the problem is. So in the Toyota production plant, they empower everyone to spend an hour a day in this little circle they draw on the manufacturing plant. You're not supposed to do any work. You're just supposed to sit there and observe what's happening on the manufacturing floor and see if you can spot inefficiencies, if you can spot waste, and come up with a continuous improvement practice around it. So I would say at a minimum, if you just put yourself in that observation mode, it will be better than kind of staying in front of the compiler all day, because you will get that breath of fresh air. Right, so how do you maintain simplicity without kind of a code bloat? So I would say that it's definitely easy to start simple. That whole idea of the minimum viable product is kind of getting down to the essence of what is going to solve a customer problem. And the reason I say that, so I would just go back to the early answer, is that the way you avoid code bloat is by being rigorous about the process, even for new features. So you want to make sure that everything you're adding in there is still addressing a need, something ideally that you can tie back to a key metric. So we'll talk about kind of causality, and when you build a feature out, you really want to be able to measure an impact of a feature. And if you can't really measure that or isolate that, then that feature shouldn't be built or should be taken out. So I would say that it's really just a function of adding enough to where those metrics keep going up and to the right when you start measuring them on a cohort basis, then it being just about more features or less features. So I don't think you necessarily have to kill anything, because killing may actually cause, again, negative metrics to go in the wrong direction. Yeah, so it's still, at the end of the day, you still have this persona of who your users are, and it's putting it in front of them at least. So even though we say, you're using Twitter as an example, Google as an example, I'll guarantee you that both of them, because I know Google does this for sure, do usability tests where they get people into their offices and they show them stuff that isn't yet even on the site, just to run through, is this really the right usability around this product? And even when they roll things out, they're doing these partial rollouts and full rollouts. I don't know if that was the question, or were you asking a different question?
Yeah, but if I'm new to this, like I'm starting up a new business,
okay,
and this is the first time I'm building something, how do I get users to test it? Like how many users should I approach, or how many people should I actually talk to?
Right, so if you're starting from day one, how do you go about testing this? I would go back to that's the original kind of problem interview, solution interview. You're trying to figure out who your right early adopters might be. And by definition, your early adopters are those who believe in your product as much as you do. So they want to see you succeed in some way. They want to give you feedback or provide feedback because you're giving them the opportunity to actually build this product in parallel with them. So in many ways, that's how you would identify. You don't need a lot. As I said before, when you get to this qualitative stage, you don't need lots and lots of users. You just need a handful of good customers. So even if you start with a handful, over time, you're trying to identify who might those customers be. You can even start to appoint people. There's this customer advisory board concept, which has no real equity associated with it. It's really just status. But you can go to a customer and say that you are really valuable to us. We'd like you to be on the advisory board because we'd like to pass these things by you. So they're just ways for you to incentivize people, whether it's through the status or even like more direct means, to have them be part of that advisory board. When you have enough users at scale, then you can start doing split testing and start testing things with them. So that's a good question. Is how do you get the feedback and have the customers really returning a call when you want to talk to them? I mean, I would say that is again part of nurturing this relationship with customers and identifying who early adopters might be. So definitely when you have enough users, you can either send out a message that's broadcast to everyone, and when enough people return, you get on. But if you're trying to target specific people, it's nurturing that relationship. So if you look at this as anything, if you're into email marketing, you know that most email marketers tell you that you have to send at least 10 value-driven messages for every ask that you make. And it's the same kind of a relationship here, is that you are more in the delivering value than capturing value business. So as long as you're delivering more value consistently than you are capturing, when you make those asks, some of those customers who are your best customers actually make time. So there's other concepts. You can actually use metrics. So I know some of you probably have heard Dharmesh talk before. He talks about this customer happiness index concept. So you can actually use metrics to be able to identify who your best customers are because they're engaging with your product. You start to reward them. You start to recognize them. Now when you reach out to them, they do want to talk to you, and they make time for you. So that's, again, all of that customer nurturing and setting up the right environment where you can do that in that timely fashion. Yeah, so if your customers and users are different, say the one that's paying you is not the one that's part of your ecosystem, you would have to figure out where this particular feature lies. Like, is it really a customer using it? Is it really a user using it? And also where the risk lies. Like, is it really, so if I use an advertising example, in many cases, the bigger risk is around engagement. So I know that if I get enough engagement, advertisers will pay for the eyeballs because that's a given. There's a market, there's a ready market for it. It's a proven business model. But I know that getting that engagement is risky, so I'm going to focus on the end users and try to make sure that I'm building the right features that engage with them. You sometimes get into instances like Facebook, for example, where you've got conflicting interests. Like your customers are advertisers, so you want to show more ads, but your users don't want to see any ads, so they find ways to ignore it. And so you're sometimes caught in between, and you have to balance that. And you know what happens with Facebook. They sometimes get into trouble trying to use data they shouldn't. But it's, again, playing that balancing act, which is how do we please customers, but at the same time not annoy users. And that's a bad place to be, and I have sympathy for those business models. I think in the best scenarios, your customers are aligned with your users' success. So if you can make your users be successful, the customers are also happy, and that's a good place to be. That's a very good question. I have a book for that one. So what are the tops? Do you want to add something? Yeah.
My experience. So in our experience, we ended up with a big global product as well, and of course we thought we were doing the right thing. When I think back on it, it's the early adopters that kept saying, I want this feature, and this feature. And they're the ones that got us in trouble, and the ones that told us, hey, I really want my business to be able to do this, or I really want to be able to look at my business this way. Those are the people that ended up using the 20% of the product that got the most value.
Yeah, and it's in some ways, like I would add to that and say that we actually, so everyone talks about lowering sign-up friction, get everyone to use your product. And I think the early adopter process is really one that is the opposite. You want to raise sign-up friction. So you want to actually create some artificial hoops or even some real hoops that people have to jump through. So we have a product that we built, this analytics product, which I was going to walk through the demo process, and we've been stuck on the slide. But the point there is that what we do is we show this demo, we get people interested, but then we ask them, it's a pricing technique, we ask them, why should you be an early adopter? Because we only have 10 seats. So tell us why you would make for an early adopter for us. So we want commitment, we want you to give us feedback, we want you to have a pressing problem today. So even will you share your metrics number with us? That's a requirement that we make them kind of agree to. And it's a very counterintuitive thing because people are scared about, and that's a pricing technique, because I say that when we are initially launching a product, we feel like we should be so lucky that anyone wants to use it. But if you've got this compelling offer, people will want to use it, and you can turn around to raise that sign of friction and get people to jump through a few of those hoops to want to use it.
I just want to say, you had the greatest jobs wanted for your Ruby engineers. Like, tell me quick, forget the resume. That was the greatest distillation of corporate culture, and would have gotten me hungry if I was a Ruby engineer. So I don't know if you want to describe it, but this was like, prove to me that you're valuable. All of a sudden, like, whoa, it becomes that scarce, desirable thing, and you really qualify.
Right, but I would just say that to early adopters, to me, that's really it, because if I'm going to be working with people, and we talk about doing things in small scale, so I'm only going to really have the bandwidth and the capacity to work with 10 early adopters. I want to ensure that at the end of my quote-unquote trial period, that I get happy referenceable customers. And so I want to identify who they are, and I'm going to ask some follow-up questions. And the pricing technique works psychologically. It's not that people run away and say, I don't want this. They actually want it more, because they're now trying to prove why shouldn't they qualify for this? What are you talking about? So it's something that kind of works, and it's pretty effective. And I learned it from there's a book called Pitch Anything, and Oren Clark is a professional fundraiser, and he uses this at the end of his pitches, where he asks the people. So he asks people what would qualify you to be on the board, because we've got all these prominent people on there. And it's kind of a similar pricing type technique. All right, so free versus paid users. So all the examples you gave, which were Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they were all multi-sided markets. So in their instance, what they wanted to do was build that asset. So for Facebook, it was getting to network effects, getting to a certain size that advertisers would really care about it. The data would be so valuable. So for them, it was not about having any sign-up friction. It was lowering the price to zero and making sure that people just got in and engaged with the product. In my case, I was building a SaaS product. So this would be more of a freemium model, where my users were going to be people that I would eventually charge for. And so I have a whole section on how to deal with freemium. So I find that many people who go with a freemium product in the beginning don't have enough data to come up with the right plans. And because entrepreneurs are a lot like artists, we tend to undervalue our work. We tend to give away a lot of features. And so we find out that was the case in my instance. I actually had early adopters. There were two of them. I remember them by name. They actually called me up and said, I really love your product, but I just want to let you know that the way you've priced it, I'm never going to pay for this. And I want to tell you that because I want to pay you so that I can keep using this product. And that's because I was giving away too much of the product for free. And so a lot of people were just stuck in that free plan. The other side of it is that there is no business model in free. So if you give away your product for free, you're not really learning anything. So even if you're considering freemium, I tell entrepreneurs to look at it more as a marketing tactic. So it's really filling your pipeline so that one day those free users will convert. But I tend to reverse it. I tend to start with the premium users first. So I will see, can I come up with something compelling, that minimum viable concept, product concept, can I get people to pay money first for a usage pattern that is the monetizable part of this? So rather than getting people who will grow into usage, why don't I start with people who have the need today and collect money from them? And then I have the luxury to go upstream or downstream. I can either go for more higher value customers, or I can use freemium as a tactic to then fill in the people who might consider an alternative, but they will use mine because it's free, and then eventually they will grow, and it's a proven product for them. So that's how I would typically see it, and that's why I feel like if you're going to charge your users eventually, copying out behind an alpha beta label is a bad idea. And even sometimes starting with freemium could be a dangerous place because you end up giving too much. You don't have enough data or learning to know how to really craft the right plan for them. Yeah, let's move on, and we can. This is fairly flexible. So you've seen most of the board. We'll stop wherever it makes sense. So where I was going with this demo is I was going to show you an example of how we built a product. So there's this user cycle product. The key question, so the key problem we were trying to answer for ourselves is giving our customers, which are going to be typically software companies, our early adopters or SaaS companies, a metrics dashboard that allowed them, if they could answer this basic question, are we making progress? And once they were able to answer that question, can they bring in causality, and can they then know what to improve? So we look at a lot of, and the way to summarize that problem is that there are all kinds of numbers floating out there, and most people drown in numbers. We wanted to create something a lot more actionable as a dashboard. And in my first edition of a book, I had a picture that looked like this, rainbow colors, not very readable. But the big question was, can we make this better? We were going to turn this into a dashboard. Can we make this so that these numbers are not that hard to understand? And so we didn't start with code. We really started this as a design exercise because in this case, the visual communication of that dashboard was very important. So we went through this process. I went through it with a designer that's on my team. We started out with this and said, this funnel view is good. It's simple. Everyone understands it. It breaks down when you put two of these two things side by side. Because if I ask you, quick, tell me which month is better, you don't have the answer. Because you have to really compare all the numbers. So we said, let's just try some visual tricks. Let's do some scaling by width or by height. And that didn't help because things were now out of alignment, very hard to read. So we said, let's just add some traffic indicators. You can now tell that the month of June were high in activation, and actually the first one should be acquisition. And then the bottom two kind of went down in the month of June. So this is better. But the obvious question was the funnel shape is not really adding anything. Like it's just a shape, but doesn't really do anything. So why don't we get rid of it? So we went with a simple bar chart. And all these were done just through rapid iteration, first internally, and then we turned this into a dashboard that we showed to people. So we basically went with this approach, and this was a good improvement from where we started. But we stumbled into this work by Stephen Fry, where he was talking about bullet charts, and we said, can we collapse this even more? And we came up with two enhancements. One of them is adding shaded areas. So the problem with this chart up here is that while I can see that the retention rate went down from 56% to 50% in June, I don't really know if I should panic yet. Is this really a very bad number, or is it still within a tolerable range? And we were trying to build a company-wide dashboard. So we wanted everyone in the team to be able to answer this, including the CEO, the marketing folks, the sales folks, not just developers. So we came up with these shading areas where you can have zones of good, bad numbers. And so we can tell that even though the retention rate fell, it's still in the white zone, so it's still nothing to panic over. It's bad that we dropped, but we're not yet in the danger zone. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was really just saying, can we encode the data from last month into this month? And that's where these ticker marks come in. So now I can look at the month of June, and I can tell that the activation rate was slightly higher because the ticker mark is May's data point. The retention rate is slightly lower, and the paid is about the same. So this was an exercise that we did to start to take these elements design elements that we started with, and said, let's come up with something that viscerally communicates whether we're making progress or not. And then we turned this into a dashboard. We began to lay it out, and it kind of started looking something like this. And these were all done in Illustrator, so they weren't done in code. We came up with lots of variations. So I had a designer who Illustrator was his tool of choice. If it hadn't been Illustrator, I would have probably used HTML or something else. But he was very fast with Illustrator. So he came up with lots of these variations. We were looking at different ways of communicating things. And eventually, we came up with a dashboard that we used in our demos. This whole process took us days, not weeks or months. And so had we been trying to build this all along, it would have been months to go build this. But by doing this thing, we were then able to come up with this demo. So we would go in front of customers, we would show them the final dashboard and talk about metrics. We'd show them some different views, have a story to go along with it, is how we identify key metrics, how you can pull up the metrics, go behind the numbers, go to the people behind the numbers. And we told a compelling enough story that people said, this is awesome, if you can build this, this is what we want, and we pay you money for it. So this is how we went through our problem solution fit stage for this particular product. And we got people to write us checks, and so I used some of the pricing technique I talked about, which is is a longer case study that's available online on how we actually took this from idea to paid customers. But there's a pricing technique, there's price anchoring, so we were charging $200 a month. There's a technique we used there to anchor the price to where it was now actually a bargain instead of it being a very high-priced product. But we eventually got people to say, hey, this is good. And if you look at the fidelity of this, no one once asked us, is this a mock-up? And we didn't have to really tell them, and it's not that we were lying. We just told them that this is a product that's in progress, which was true, is that we are doing the design work for it, and we would turn this to HTML eventually. And we had the technical skills in-house to know that all of this was feasible, that we could turn this into HTML. It was not where we were showing Flash, and it was hard to replicate that behavior in HTML. So there was no deception, and it was really showing them a real product with real-looking data to get the customers to buy into it. Yeah, so how high of fidelity to go? And so again, it requires you to understand your customer segments. In this particular case, because we were trying to compete against the alternatives, which tend to be products that had a lot of data points, I would use Google Analytics as the one to attack, but all of them really throw numbers at you. If you look at Google Analytics, you wouldn't have a screen as simple as this. You would have 1,000 numbers easily to look at, and people get overwhelmed with all of that. So for us, it was visually communicating, and these design elements were very important because we would even, as a usability test, I missed this part, as a usability test, before we even went to pitching this product or doing the solution interviews, we would just show this to some random entrepreneurs and say, tell us what you're looking at. Tell us if, is this product doing better or worse? And they would just start looking at the screen and coming up with explanations of what these numbers mean, what was going on. And once we got to a point where people could at least explain what was going on the screen, then we felt like we had something that was viscerally powerful. So in this case, visual was very important. If I was building a different feature, I might not go through such an elaborate design process. So it is really understanding the customer use case. Again, if you were building a product for creatives, sometimes you have to make sure that the fidelity is very high because their right brain, when they look at your mock-ups, they're going to start judging color and balance and fonts. And if it's under their expectations, they just know they don't want your product. Unconsciously, or they may not even consciously express that. If you're doing something for accountants and lawyers, they might be looking at functionality over form. So as long as you can tell them how they can get in and get out, that's what they really want to know. So show me that use case, that what I'd call the money slide. Show me how do I really solve my problem with your product rather than walk me through this long-winded demo. So that's why these demos are very strategically developed so that they're short, but they really should hit on the pain points that the customers have. So we start off with a problem statement, we then walk through the scenario, let me show you how I solve it. And within, in this case, within 2 to 3 minutes, we would communicate how you can solve that problem, and people are either excited or they're not. It's a binary condition for us. So once we're done through the mock-up process, some of this stuff will go pretty quickly. So we then have permission. So now we have gone through this demo stage, and it goes through a lot of iterations. So even I showed you this happy path. It wasn't as happy because we got people asking for more things or asking questions, and so we went back and refined the mock-up some. So there is this backwards iterative process. But then we go into the point where we're actually coding this up. So we go code it up, and then we do a partial rollout. And what we want to do here is measure qualitatively first. We want to measure at small scale. And this is something I've been saying before, is that you don't really need lots of users. You just need a few good customers. So in our case, it was raising that sign of friction to say we are going to charge money from day one, but that's because we feel the value proposition is strong. We want to make sure we identify the right early adopters that are also motivated and incentivized to use us and give us feedback. So we came up with 10 customers. I have a blog post called the 10x launch, which I was going to add a slide here with a picture of that because it's a good slide to look at. But the idea is that it's really a stage rollout. When you're trying to build a product, it's not about, even though in this product we'd like to get thousands of paying customers, if we can get 10 people, give them the high touch treatment, give them like bend over backwards to give them the best support, if we can get them to become referenceable customers, there's no way we can do that with 1,000 people, like opening the gates to everyone. So I came up with this 10x model, which is exactly what we did in this product. Is let's start out with just 10 customers that we handpicked. So I'm actually raising sign-up friction. I'm making sure that these are the people who need this the most. And if we can't even get those customers happy, there's no way we can get everyone else happy. So it's, again, hitting the easy button. But if you can't do the easy stuff, you won't be able to do the harder stuff. Sure. Yeah. So in the B2C, so once you have, I would say that it depends on the stage you're in. If you're in the very early stage, say you're trying to build the next Facebook or Twitter, you may only have 10, 20 people. So you would still do that similar model. So I like to use Facebook a lot because unlike a lot of social networks, they didn't open Facebook to everyone. They were very disciplined about staying within the Harvard dorm and then the Harvard campus. And then they very systematically went from Ivy League school to Ivy League school. They employed a tactic that maybe I kind of borrowed, and that is the exclusivity. So they built up a lot of pent-up desire. We're not going to roll it out to just any school. You have to qualify. You have to be worthy of getting this product. And it created all this desire. So once they put it in that school, there was so much hunger for it that within 30 days they had full school, 80% penetration, people logging in multiple times a day because they're just curious, what is this? And it was a good product, and networks were well connected. So they very quickly systemized that, but I would say that they use that to their benefit. So even in the B2C world, you might start out with a small with a small user base, but certainly as your user base grows, then those partial rollouts make more sense. So 10%, 20%, and then everyone. It's great for doing this kind of demo testing. So it's a very good lean startup-like tool. So if you really look at what Kickstarter does, is it lets you build that demo and get customers to fund your product based on the value proposition. So it's not about features that I'm going to go build because I like cool technology, but it's always kind of the customer-focused side of things. So I think it's a great platform. Whether you use Kickstarter or you build your own, doesn't really matter, but that same concept, that's a problem-solution fit validation tactic. You can go and do what I call the Mafia offer. So that's what I just showed you with the user cycle, that was a Mafia offer, and it's Mafia because it's an offer that's too good for people to refuse. They actually want it so bad that they're willing to pay you on the spot. And you do it by doing the problem interview, solution interview, showing them a compelling demo. It's like a direct sales type of process. The Kickstarter is more of a pre-order type option, which is we're going to build this product. If you have interest, vote on your interest based on the money that you give us. The third kind of problem solution fit test is the smoke test, the smoke screen or smoke test type of offer, which is a good example of that is Dropbox, where you might put a demo out there and say just express interest by giving us your email address. And if all of a sudden you get 100,000 email addresses like they did or higher in a few days, then there's huge, huge interest and demand for this. It gives you permission to then go build it. In their case, get into YC and do all the stuff that they did afterwards. Is feedback from people who are not your target customers valuable? The short answer is no. So I oftentimes like sometimes people even come to me and they share an idea with me and ask me what I think. Is it viable? I'm like, it's not what I think, it's what your target customers really think. So ultimately, it is about your target customers. Now, your target customer assumption or hypothesis may be wrong. So if they don't think it's valuable, that is a search of the right customer segment. But if you clearly know that this is not your target customer, then it's really not that valuable. I mean, maybe I'll reframe it differently. It can be valuable for different reasons. So if you were showing your business model canvas, your lean canvas, to an investor or to an advisor, and they were giving you feedback on the overall business model, that advice could be still valuable. So they are really asking different questions, which might be around channels and scalability. So I wouldn't say that you only talk to your customers. There are different conversations you have with different people, but for different objectives. Yeah, so how do you know that you've hit product market fit? So there are typically 3 stages that a product goes through. The first stage I characterize as problem solution fit. And the key question there is this a problem worth solving? So we do these Kickstarter tests, smoke tests, the Mafia offer. Can we go get 10 people to want this product so bad they pay us on the spot? So that all gives you permission to go to the next stage. In the next stage, you want to have a number of customers. So it's about building that MVP and having enough customers derive continuous value from your product. So in our case, it would be them not paying just for month one, but having a long lifetime value. So them, loving the product, giving us a testimonial, paying for it month over month, and choosing to be a case study, all of those kinds of things. Once we can do that as a number that you use, we won't have time to talk about how you get to that number, but you back in from your eventual goal. So if your goal is to get 10,000 customers, the 10x model would be going down a factor of 10. So I might go down to 1,000 customers. Say if I have 1,000 paying customers, then I have product market fit. And then once you have that stage, again, it's a fuzzy, it's not a magic number, it's kind of a fuzzy number, but there should be enough revenue coming in. You should have a point where where you're successful enough that you will not fail. Your priority then shifts more towards scaling. So you are less concerned about new feature development. You might put that a little bit on the back burner and do more maintenance type of upkeep work and shift all your focus towards acquisition and referral and those kinds of things. Yes, so there are two questions in there. Did we discount and then did we test pricing with the customers? So on the discounting question, I would say no. So I've actually done lots of tests. When I did my book, I did discount and I found that the early adopters would have paid full price anyways. So early adopters, remember, are as incentivized as you are, as long as you're offering a fair price by removing objections. So in our case, we said it's going to be $20 a month. We know it's expensive, but most people build this stuff on their own, and they easily spend 20, 30 hours a month doing it. So the way we anchored against that is we said, if you can build that demo that we showed you with 4 developer hours a month, then you're in good shape. But most people were not, and they said, oh no, I need to buy your product because I don't want to be spending 20 developer hours building something that's non-core. So that's the first part of it. As far as like price testing, the question there comes down to understanding the existing alternatives. So we knew that people were spending about 20 to 30 developer hours, or they were using a competitor's product. So those became price anchors, and we brought that into the interview, and we anchored against them. And so typically I use, so as long as you charge anything less than your existing alternative, you're okay, but you still obviously want to make it be such that you're providing just way more value than you're capturing. So I usually go down to 20, 30% of whatever they're paying. So if it's 20, 30 hours, I'll kind of shrink it down, and that would be a price that is more than fair. And that's why it's that Mafia offer, is that if I know you're spending this much time, money, effort doing something, and I'm willing to save you 60 to 70% of that expense and that time, why wouldn't you want to try this? So for us, it was not as much price testing at that level. And again, in the beginning, it's not about price optimization, but I almost say having a price that seems fair and just starting somewhere. As we have got more data, we have realized that some of these customers are actually very profitable for us because they have very high margin customers. They don't send us a lot of data, which taxes our servers. Others are actually taxing us a lot more. And so we might come back and now refine pricing. But because these 10 customers took a leap of faith with us, we might just grandfather them in. So that's the policy we have. Some people go and charge people the right prices, but we just say, hey, we got you at $200 a month. That's what you'll pay as long as you're on this tier. But moving forward, if you outgrow it, then the price will adjust. But for everyone new, we do go in and start adjusting pricing. Okay, 5 minutes left. So maybe just on this point, when you're first starting out, you don't need lots of users. And so I even say that you don't need lots of fancy analytics. When we started out with this user cycle product, we just created a Trello board, which is kind of a pipeline. So you can, if you look at the top, if you can read the top headlines, they were really the customer funnel that I showed you. And so rather than trying to get metrics to track 10 customers, which would just be overkill, we went ahead and just put these boards up with the customer names that we assigned people on the team to be the representatives who were responsible for knowing where these customers were in the adoption funnel. And we just tracked these 10 customers. And our goal was, if we can get all these 10 people to the right, which is happy paying customers, then we have validated that we have at least done that initial validation of building something valuable. And now we can go and open this up and go from 10 to 100 customers. And that raises different challenges. So if I just kind of finish this picture, this whole qualitative stage when you launch, again, has this feedback loop. So things are not going to go as planned. You're going to have lots of learning. So you go back and you're going to build more stuff. You're going to roll it out and go back and forth on this board with that feature. But eventually you do a full rollout, and this is where you go out and quantitatively validate things. And at this stage, you either keep the feature because it has met your quantitative goal, or you kill it. So I do have more slides where I talk about cohort analysis, and that was something I mentioned in the talk. So since we don't have time for that, I will probably share some links on things that you can watch instead that will get into how you do the quantitative validation. I'll just kind of end by saying that even when you get lots of users, the learning doesn't become easier just because you have more users. I sometimes envy the time when I only had 10 customers because I knew them on a first-name basis. I could pick up the phone, they would take my call, we could have a conversation, and if I could build a business just with 10 customers, I would be very happy. But when you start adding thousands of customers, they all act differently, or they all behave differently. You start to get kind of lower quality users. Some of them are really just kicking tires, others don't care about you as much. So you start to deal with also what I call the curse of data, is that you get so much data now that being able to process it intelligently is the new challenge. So using things like cohort analysis are one of those ways to try to make sense of data, because your product is always changing. You're adding new features, you're doing new marketing around it, your customers start talking to other customers, and so all of a sudden things are out of your control. Your product is just kind of has a life of its own. So how do you really answer that basic question, are we making progress or not? So I'll kind of share links on things that you can see kind of in that realm, and it's probably a good place to stop. Thanks.